Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our professional development webinar series for parish and diocesan ministers. Our goal in this series is to provide you, parish staff, and diocesan ministers and volunteers the formation, training, and tools that you need to create vibrant parishes and growing ministries. We're very excited today to welcome Ted Miles from the Catholic Relief Services. He's going to be sharing a presentation about understanding and sharing Pope Francis's encyclical, Laudato Si. And he is going to give some kind of tools and also some resources that you can use with your parishes and your parishioners about introducing people to this encyclical. So before we get started, I want to just go through a few of the technical information. My name is Jared Dees. I'm the digital marketing manager at Ave Maria Press, and I'll be moderating the webinar. This webinar is brought to you exclusively in partnership, once again, with the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. We're very grateful for the partnership that we've had with these organizations for many years going back for this series. Once again, if you're interested in asking questions, the questions may be sent to our presenter using the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel. I'll offer as many of those questions as I can to our presenter towards the end of the presentation, but you can ask them at any time during the talk. I'd also like to note the webinar is being recorded, and we will send a recording out to you later this week. You will be able to see the slideshow, but you will not be able to see the live video if you're here seeing our pretty faces. So with that, I want to welcome Ted Miles, who works for Catholic Relief Services as the relationship manager for the youth and religious education and coordinator of the agency's youth outreach in the United States. Ted has obtained a professional certificate in youth ministry and has served in parish ministry, Catholic high school education, and archdiocesan leadership development for more than 25 years. For his commitment to work with young people, the National Federation of Catholic Youth Ministry awarded Ted a national award for leadership in youth ministry in the area of gospel values of peace and justice. Ted's great passion is his commitment to mission, Catholic social teaching, and its call for long-term social justice. So Ted, thanks so much for being with us, and we're excited for your presentation.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And thanks to Ave Maria Press and everybody for the invitation. And it's thank you all for joining us too. It's wonderful to be here with you. So I am been told now to show my screen, and we'll go ahead and put this PowerPoint in place. And I hope everybody can see that, and I hope everybody too can hear everything. And I apologize up front if I sound a little nasally. I have a bad allergy. This is a bad allergy season for me, so I was struggling with that a little bit this weekend, but it's great to be here with all of you. I'd like to begin with a prayer in the same way that Pope Francis has framed the encyclical with prayer, starting off with the beautiful recitation from St. Francis, and he ends it with one of two prayers, one that I'd like to begin with. And so I'd like to frame this conversation and presentation in prayer as well. So if we could pause for a moment and remember that we are now and always in God's holy presence. And we continue in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. And we pray a prayer for our earth. And I invite you to pray along quietly as I read. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. I'm just going to move things around so I can make sure I see. And there we go. So Thanks again to everybody for joining us. I'd like to give you a little bit of a sense of what we're going to be doing today during our time together. Based on some feedback that we received prior, I looked at some core approaches to this and narrowed it down to 4 areas that I'd like to explore with all of you today. The first one being some core ideas and themes of Laudato Si. I have to admit, I'm not a theologian. My experience, having studied theology, my experience was more in the as a practitioner of theology in ministry, as an educator and a former youth minister, and now as the relationship manager for youth and education outreach here at Catholic Relief Services. But what I would like to do is break open some core themes based on my own reading and some research that I've done of what others have seen in Laudato Si. And then also look a little bit as to what's next, having released this encyclical in June, what's next for the Catholic Church as this continues to unfold, as we continue to learn and study it, as we continue to apply it to our ministries. And then leading into, from there, how do we engage the U.S. Catholic community around this encyclical and so many of the important themes that Pope Francis challenges us. And then finally, we'll leave a few minutes at the end for some dialogue and questions. So as we go forward, jumping into some of the core themes of Laudato Si, it's important to understand that Pope Francis continues a tradition here. A tradition, at least within our social teaching, that is over 120 years in the making, that began back at the time of the Industrial Revolution, which has had such an impact on the environment that we see today and on some of the global disparity with regard to wealth that we see today. This tradition is really, the social tradition of our church is really about looking at the realities that we're faced with, trying to understand how to read the current sides of the times, understand them, and then how to respond them. When it comes to actually responding to the environment, and in particular in this case too, climate change as woven throughout the encyclical, we have to understand that Pope Francis I is not just offering an encyclical, a document that's born out of his opinion. It's a document that is born out of great dialogue, dialogue with our social tradition, dialogue with scientists, dialogue with the universal church of today around the world. And I'm particularly impressed with that. As we read through the encyclical, you'll see how he speaks to realities around the world that really came from dialogue with leaders of church and church communities from around the world. Moreover, too, Pope Francis is not the first pope to speak about the environment. Pope Paul VI had mentioned the core issues around the environment back during his time. For St. John Paul II, environmental destruction, environmental care, stewardship was of great concern. And then Pope Benedict was more recently called the Green Pope. So Pope Francis is not just pulling this out of thin air. Pope Francis is really continuing a long-standing tradition within our church. Pope Francis also reclaims a cosmological vision of a creating God, and an interconnectedness, if you will, between God, humanity, and creation. What do I mean by that? Well, I often have said or have shared with the young people that I used to teach that Catholic social teaching is, another name for Catholic social teaching is Catholic imagination. It's a way of bringing the lens of our faith to bear on realities of today. It's a way of applying an imagination from our tradition into the realities of today so that there is a new imagination, a new way of imagining the issues, so that issues themselves or concerns or realities don't seem so hopeless. I think Pope Francis is bringing us back into an old imagination, a cosmological vision that's rooted in Scripture and that was expanded upon over the centuries by our church fathers and mothers, by mystics, and then even into more recently our Catholic social teaching. It's a cosmological vision that situates God as the center of all of this. Our creating God is the one who situated humans in a cosmological framework. In other words, humans aren't the ones who are placed in nature to master and control it. Instead, humans are part of this amazing creation. And we have to understand our role as one of caretakers, one of stewards, one of recognizing the impact that all of our decisions have. So Francis is trying to bring us back into a sense of this interconnectedness, an interconnectedness that flows from our own relationship to God and into all of creation itself. It's a move away from, as he says, an anthropocentric view of nature where we are the center and instead we see God as the center. Moving further along, it's also important to understand that Laudato Si is a social encyclical. It falls in the realm of this rich social tradition. And within that social tradition, we typically follow the process, a paradigm of see, judge, act. Now, sometimes you may see that see, judge, act as a circle from see to judge to act. I like to think it more of interlocking or interconnected chain, if you will, where they continue to form and inform each other. What we see, how we move into a social analysis and a theological reflection, and how we respond out of that. And that response continues to deepen our ability to see, which also continues to deepen our ability to understand a situation and dig deeper in. And so understanding this framework of see, judge, act, let's take a little bit of a look at how Pope Francis applied that. So we see at the very beginning in chapter 1 an encountering of the issue of the ecological crisis that we're in. So in chapter 1 he speaks about the very causes for concern, the causes that we see as very interconnected to this. What is it that tells us about the situation that we're in? And Pope Francis takes stock of the situation, and in my opinion, he's extremely blunt in this part. He speaks about pollution, about what the water insecurity of our world, the throwaway culture, the loss of biodiversity, the air problems, the land problems, so many other things that have put us at a crisis situation. He sees this as serious, as urgent, and he sees so much of this as resulting from exploitation of the world that we're in. One of my favorite aspects of this area, though, when he introduces the issue of climate change, is that he sees climate as a common good. I've never really heard anybody use that before, but he says in paragraph 23, the climate is a common good, belonging to all and meant for all. It's a new and fascinating way, in my opinion, of looking at the reality around us, understanding that climate does impact how we live. It does impact our quality of life. And it impacts, too, the seriousness of some of the situations that we face in life. And all we have to do is look at this very severity of storms that we faced over the last couple of years. The other aspect of Chapter 1 is also moving into a discussion or analysis beyond just the Earth itself, but also looking at some of the surrounding situations, the surrounding issues that impact this situation, and in particular, global inequality and societal breakdown. And he really takes an analysis of globalization in our world today. And you see throughout this section that Pope Francis stands with the poor. He says that the greatest impact of all this environmental degradation the greatest impact is on the poor and vulnerable, most often the people who contribute the least. And he takes aim at affluent and wealthy societies that have often contributed the most to environmental degradation and climate change, and who have often taken the least responsibility for it as well. This is basically an untenable situation, according to Pope Francis, and it is something that is going to make many of us very uncomfortable, his analysis within this, but yet it's a message that we need to hear. As we then move into a much deeper analysis, reflection, and reframing of the issue, hence judge, we see that Pope Francis looks at a couple of core themes through this. One is the gospel of creation, where he uses Scripture as a template for his theological reflection. And we come to understand that or maybe we come to hear again, and it's emphasized more strongly, that creation was trusted as a gift and that we have a responsibility to care for creation and to protect all of creation. And in that protection of creation, we understand that we, as a part of it, are also protecting the life and the dignity of humans. One of my favorite parts of this whole section is where he talks about Jesus' gaze and the mystery of Christ that's bound up in creation. You see, if we understand that Jesus knew that God's incarnation started much long before, at this very special moment, this particular incarnation, Jesus, is speaking to us in the most profound ways as he gazes upon as he gazes upon creation so lovingly and understands the beauty and the sacredness within. It's almost gazing upon God, the creating God, who continues to invite us to be bound up in the same way of seeing creation as sacred, as beautiful. The second aspect of this, in chapter 3, the second aspect of the social analysis where Pope Francis really digs into the roots of the crisis, he names global inequality and societal breakdown. And again, as I mentioned, he stands with the poor, but in large part because the poor who have been disregarded and unknown have a story to tell. And all too often, it's those of us in our affluence or our wealth who have stood away, who have been distanced from the poor, who don't often understand the impact that our decisions make on either the poor themselves or on the environment, who don't often understand the impact that environmental degradation and destruction has on their lives, on the quality of their lives. And so Pope Francis makes a shift where the love of neighbor is global. And so for us, it's a matter of understanding, again, this deeper interconnectedness, and that we are not masters over nature, nor are we masters over ourselves, that there's an interconnectedness, that we need to somehow figure out a way to make decisions, to live in a way where we recognize and respect that deep connectedness. He moves us into an integral ecology following through that analysis, where Pope Francis talks about a solidarity with all God's creation, the solidarity that should frame all that we do, that leads to a much deeper respect for all life, a deeper respect for the common good, our responsibility to really care for all of creation. And then finally, in the closing chapters of the encyclical, Pope Francis leads us into a place where we can act. It's a response that's rooted in hope and transformation, and that's key. Pope Francis, as you know, has often been known for his culture of encounter, and I think he builds upon that in this encyclical, framing, at least in chapter 5, a culture of dialogue, a dialogue about the environment with each other, a dialogue across nations and communities and all that divides us at times, a dialogue with leadership, those who make the most important decisions, a dialogue with science as well, so that we come to a better understanding of climate change, the environment, and our role within all of that and our impact within that. And he also talks about a dialogue that moves us from short-term weak responses that all too often have characterized our response to more structural change, to a response that's more sustainable, to a response that has deeper impact and deeper care for all of life. And thus he leads us into the closing chapter of an ecological education and spirituality. The reality is that if the dialogue would lead to better policies, better laws, a better understanding of structural and systemic change, unless we also have the individual change and the personal conversion and transformation, those laws will be for naught. And so he frames this last chapter in a position of hope, where we can indeed live our lives into an ecological citizenship, an ecological citizenship that's rooted in covenant, the same covenant that God makes with all of us. Again, that deep respect for all of life. And it's an ecological conversion that's grounded in spirituality. We all know that Pope Francis is known for the gospel of joy, his framing around joy and hope. And indeed, he says earlier in the encyclical, injustice is not invincible. In other words, we live with an ever-renewing God, a God that will continue to work with us, a God that will continue to work through us. And in that, we find the spirituality that can really guide us to a place of transformation and hope. So a few of those themes around the encyclical, and what next as we come to more deeply understand what Pope Francis has given us. Well, in talking to a couple of my friends at the Catholic Climate Covenant as well as the Bishops' Conference, what I'm hearing are three basic ideas around what comes next. The first one being short-term, in that the encyclical right now is still in the process of reflection. The encyclical is only 4 months old. There's been a great deal of challenge that's been provided for all of us, challenge that hopefully fosters transformation, but that demands that the encyclical be read well. In fact, the Bishops' Conference through the Catholic Climate Covenant are sponsoring a theology and ministry symposium coming up where theologians and academics will come together with practitioners of ministry later in November to really begin to look at some of what this is saying to us as a church and what does this mean in the way that we help the Catholic Church understand. Medium range, well, the hope would be that there's an ongoing communication of the themes and the messages of Laudato Si. Hopefully through homilies, we'll see more of that in liturgy, in parish and school programs, religious education, and so forth. But it's a matter of taking it and helping the U.S. Catholic Church begin to understand the rich content that is there. And then being so inspired by that, having done that well, hopefully, we can then be seen as a major animator of caring for creation and poor people throughout the world. Such a gift that the Catholic Church has already been in so many social issues of our day and throughout history. Here's one where it really calls the courage and the prophetic quality of all people. So can the church be seen as inspiration? Can the church help to inform policy that is just? Can the church be that embodiment of stewardship where all creation is cared for and we meet the urgent demands of our time? So how then do we engage the U.S. Catholic community? How can we take what has been given to us and help to mobilize? And I'd like to do this in two segments. One is just entering into an understanding of a more general framing of how we can help inform the U.S. Catholic community, and then the second part, giving you some concrete resources. And I'd like to start with a video that launched a new series, a new video series by the USCCB, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and CRS. It's a series called CST, Catholic Social Teaching 101. And the very first video that we released had to do with care for creation. And I'm sharing this with you because I think the framing of the video itself can help us to frame what can be a politically divisive, a volatile issue. I'm sure have seen that even the mention of the word climate change will automatically turn off some people. They'll tune out and they may want nothing to do with us. And the reality is, when we look at what we're hearing, when we look at what science is providing for us, when we look at this beautiful encyclical that unfolds, we have to understand the urgency of this. But how then do we enter into a way where people are willing to dialogue, where people are willing to hear and listen to each other from all sides? So I start with this video, and if it gets a little quirky here for a moment, it means I have to remove my head mic and turn the sound through. So hopefully you'll be able to hear this and watch it. You may find that the sound doesn't always match the video itself because of the streaming that we have. However, I have provided a copy of the video to Jared, who will post it later this week for viewing of your own again and for sharing with your community. So it starts off with a few moments of quiet, and when you see the video start, that's when the sound should come in.
I don't know if you can hear me, but this sound's not working right now. If you could maybe plug in, plug it back, unplug again, it might work.
So I hope that was just trying to reclaim where we are here.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
apologize, Ted. The sound didn't come through even after we tested it multiple times, and it worked perfectly right before we started. But like you said earlier, we'll post a link to the video, and a bunch of people have said that they have seen it um, on Facebook and other places in CRS's website. So they've all those that have seen it were praising it, and I'm excited. We'll share it later on this week.
Again, I apologize for that. And actually, in order for me to be able to show the video, I had to diminish all of the other parts. So if and then in removing the headset, I didn't necessarily hear if there was any messages coming through. So again, my apologies. But the key idea behind that video is a framing around care for creation. And it's a beautiful way of beginning the dialogue rather than starting with the issue of climate change, which, as I mentioned before, and we all know how politically divisive it has become in this country. And the reality is it's challenging to begin to talk about something like that that can be so overwhelming, and that for most of us, we don't even necessarily understand the science behind. So where can we begin as people of faith? And I think that's under the much larger virtue of caring for creation, a primary theme of Catholic social teaching. And so the goal for all of us is to just simply begin to foster dialogue. We can even do that in liturgy or in the liturgies that we experience by working with our pastors and priests, by working with liturgy committees, by working with the leaders within our church that can speak and offer reflections towards the end of Mass. We can use liturgy as a place of forming people and a place of beginning the dialogue, and hopefully in a way that's inspiring and in a way that's safe for people, and in a way that guides us to seek and identify common ground on the issues and the concerns that we do share and the ways of responding. We may not all agree, for instance, that human action is responsible for climate change. However, we can certainly agree that human action is responsible for pollution and for water insecurity at times, or for other environmental forms of destruction that impact all of us. And so how can we begin to simply just look at some of those realities and then understand what we can do differently in a way of changing the situation that helps to improve the quality of life for all? But I would make sure that as we go about doing this, that we include young people in the conversation. Pope Francis explains in his encyclical that this isn't just about us today, but it's about all future generations. So it's an interconnectedness, not just with our God, with each other, and with our earth in the present, but it's an interconnectedness with all who will go after us. So young people, when I speak to them at least, have a great deal of concern for their future. Invite young people into this conversation because I think their passion about this issue and their concern about this will help to inspire, or can help to inspire, and can help people perhaps to listen more carefully. And remember to pray. There are such beautiful prayers throughout our tradition, particularly that were born out of St. Francis and Franciscan spirituality. So I encourage you to look at that, look at some of those prayers, and use those as a way of helping us to enter into dialogue. Begin the dialogue, and then foster that culture of encounter. This is where we may talk about full integration. When you look at some of the core themes in the encyclical, it's pretty clear that Pope Francis continues his theme of encounter and recognizes the distance that all too often many of us have with our brothers and sisters living in poverty. And so in this sense of integration and understanding environmental justice and understanding climate change, let's tell the story, let's connect each other with our sisters and brothers in poverty in a way that's rooted in relationship. We can go out and serve people. We can enter into service that's rooted in relationship. We can also enter into stories and through speakers and through film. Several years ago, I had the great opportunity of leading an immersion delegation through CRS down to Bolivia and Peru. While there, we entered into the Diocese of Huancayo, Peru, where Archbishop Pedro Barreto, Archbishop Pedro Jimenez Barreto was the head of that diocese. When Bishop Pedro entered into the diocese, in order to get to the sea, he had to pass through La Arroyo, which was the 8th most polluted, or still is, the 8th most polluted city in the world. When he went through, he saw images of mountains that were completely void of any kind of life, mountains that looked like they might have been covered with snow, but instead were covered with acid dust, and mountains of black dirt filled with poisonous mercury and other leads and other metals and materials that came through the mining operation that was at the heart of the economy of La Arroyo. Interestingly enough, that mining company came from the United States after regulations here more or less made it very difficult for them to operate their business in a way that would ensure the kind of profit that was desired. And so moving to Peru, where there was little regulation, they went in, set up shop, and also created a situation where people were paid a lot less. Bishop Pedro, as he began to enter into his own ministry as the Archbishop, he learned that there were many people that were struggling with workers' rights and situations of protection within the mines, but he also began to learn that there was a great deal of illness within the community, and he suspected lead poisoning. He developed a partnership with St. Louis University, who came down and set up a science lab in his chancery. I'll talk about thinking outside the box and thinking differently about his work. And he made it his first pastoral mission to either establish better rights for people in La Arroyo or to shut down the mine. Eventually, St. Louis helped to make the case that through their analysis of people in the situation, that many people were living with lead poisoning up to 10 times the limits recommended by the World Health Organization. They did a study of the environment and found dead streams, and there was no way that life could grow around their community. Eventually, Bishop Pedro did shut down the mine, and later, a few years later, it reopened under a whole new set of regulations. When we were there visiting with him, one of our delegates asked what we could do to help share in his own efforts and in his mission. And he paused and he said three things. Whenever you denounce evil, you must also announce good news. And it was a humble reflection on his part, having entered into a much deeper relationship with the people of La Arroyo. It was a humble reflection in that he shut down the mine, but now there were 3,000 people whose livelihood was gone. And so how do you then create a situation that helps to sustain their lives still and helps to protect their own livelihoods and their own dignity and their lives and their families and so forth? And so it took him deeper into the issue, but it was all born out of a deeper connection with the people of La Arroyo. The second thing he said was to build awareness, and that's the mission of education that flows from this. We'll talk about that in a second. And the third thing he said, and it was the only thing that he said in English as he pointed to all of us, and he said, you Americans must change your lifestyle. Now, there was this collective gulp within the room, and it wasn't a judgment statement as much as it was a reflection on the connectedness that we all share. That the economic decisions that we make for materials that have precious minerals that are mined elsewhere in the world impact the lives of those people in other parts of the world. Do we make an effort to understand that? Do we make an effort to advocate for better systems that protect people when we buy or when we mine for those resources? It's a way of understanding, again, his challenge, the connectedness that we all share, that we can't escape that. And thus that leads to the second point, and how do we help people connect with all God's creation as well? We may not be able to take people to Peru or to Bolivia. We can bring people to them through stories, speakers, and film, but we can certainly help people develop a deeper appreciation for the creation right around us, through the parks that are available to us, by moving some of our activities into nature, outdoor retreats and prayer experiences, by tapping into people who have a deep appreciation for all of creation. And I particularly lift up our Native American brothers and sisters who have taught me so much about their own sense of the sacredness of creation. And how do we bring the beauty of God's creation right into our celebrations and into our own environments around us? That can begin to help people understand this deeper sense of an encounter with all God's creation. For me, one of those more powerful experiences came about as a high school teacher. I started working at Cardinal Gibbons School, an inner city Catholic school here in Baltimore, Maryland. And in my first month there, the biology teacher and I were taking a group of it was an all-boys school, a group of young men up to Baltimore County. Now, Baltimore County is simply rolling hills. There's no mountains or anything like that, but it is certainly much more rural than Baltimore City. And as we were driving up, one of my students, who could be a little smart alecky, said, Mr. Miles, are these the mountains? And thinking he was being a little smart alecky, I responded back rather goofily, totally disregarding what he might be getting at when he said, well, I've never been out of the city before. I didn't realize these weren't the mountains. And I felt horrible. But it was one of those eye-opening moments that so many of the young people that we serve in urban communities never really get a deep appreciation for God's creation because they don't have the chance to enter into that. When we got off the bus, I turned to the biology teacher and I said, we're getting these kids out of the city once in a while. And sure enough, we started a High Adventure Club trip, or High Adventure Club, and we took trips on an annual basis to national parks, out into nature where they could more deeply appreciate all that God has given us. He brought in the science, I brought in the spirituality, and to watch the expressions, to watch the impact that being out in nature had on young people demonstrated to me that it's for us in making a difference in this environmental crisis, ecological crisis we face today. It's imperative that we connect people with God's creation, because that is a place where people can themselves become so connected to our creating God. And that leads into education. While framing the issue of climate change under care for creation, we cannot not ignore the issue of climate change. We do have to educate. We have to acknowledge the discomfort that we have in talking about it. And somehow we still, though, have to be prophetic because of the urgency of the issue itself. So how do we tell the local and global story? How do we begin to weave that into all that we do? I encourage you to stay focused and committed. You can develop parish and school creation care teams, which I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes, environmental justice teams, and so forth. And look for those gathered and non-gathered ways of educating. We certainly have those moments where we can weave in opportunities to educate through religious education, adult education, and so forth. There's some ideas listed right there. But even the non-gathered ways of helping people sometimes just to begin reflecting on this through bulletin inserts, artwork that's posted around our parish community or school communities, social media posts around the building itself, the complexes where we minister. And then ultimately, we need to help people take action to reduce their footprint, but take action in a way that's hopeful, realistic, and practical. I think one of the common challenges within this is not just the aspect of denial around climate change, but it's also the feeling of learned helplessness, that the issue is so much bigger, so what difference can I make? Well, I think one of those ways that we can inspire people is through the communal approach. We can take the lead at church by recycling ourselves, using non-perishable materials, using recycled materials at our parish gatherings, establishing community gardens, establishing other community efforts that help people join together in this effort to care for creation. And even as a church or a school, looking at your collective footprint. And there's resources that can help you do that through the Catholic Climate Covenant. And then even within our own social gatherings, our church bazaars, our school bazaars and sales, can we partner with organic, eco-friendly, and fair trade organizations that help to educate a little bit more and give people a sense of what their options might be? Then that too then, from there, we also lead people into individual responses and to offer ideas that are practical and sustainable. And you'll see in the resources that follow, there's a number of places where we can get ideas for that go beyond just mere recycling, but that lead people to think about their daily behaviors in a way that can foster much bigger change than simply putting something in a recycling bin versus a trash bin. As important as that is, how can we begin to think bigger? And how do we provide resources for our community and then even lead them into local efforts and national efforts that can foster systemic change? There are the resources for that. And so what are some of those? Well, the lead organization around climate change in the Catholic Church in the U.S. Catholic Church is the Catholic Climate Covenant. They have a Feast of St. Francis program, which Feast of St. Francis being October 4th is launched every year in September for that feast, but the resources have a long shelf life and goes beyond. So you can use and access those resources to help your parishioners, your school, understand the encyclical on a deeper level through their discussion guides and their activity guides. They have just established a new program called Creation Care Teams. Resources available for parishes to really break open and explore some of the very things I was just talking about. How do we respond on a communal level? They have an advocacy initiative that is focused domestically, information on their website, and I mentioned earlier the Theology and Ministry Conference. But the core grounding for all that the Catholic Climate Covenant, or the core way of engagement that the Catholic Climate Covenant offers, is the St. Francis Pledge to care for creation and the poor. So inviting parishioners to stand collectively with other Catholics across the nation is a strong way of motivating. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has an environmental justice program. Around the encyclical itself, there's a number of resources. The copies of the encyclical are available for purchase. They have a discussion guide, liturgical and preaching resources, resources for action, and encyclical video that was released by the Vatican. And later this year, you'll learn more about the CCEHD, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development Multimedia Art Contest, which is built all around the idea of care for creation. And it's a way of engaging young people in a multimedia arts contest about the work of the church in the effort to help foster environmental justice. And there's additional resources, but their primary resource that I think could be of great help in this is the 2 feet of love in action, the framing of our response as a way of fostering the path of love through charity and through social justice or systemic change. And you can see the links down there. The second link, We Are Salt and Light, is a set of materials all built around parishes organizing together to be a community of salt and light, to respond in the way of justice. And then CRS offers a number of resources that can help you explore this issue and in particular tell the global story. The work that CRS does around the world helps to lessen, mitigate, and adapt the impact of climate change. It helps people lessen the experience of it in our efforts through emergency relief and in our agricultural and health efforts as well. But where needed and where we recognize that change is already occurring, how do we help people adapt the work that they're doing, their livelihoods, so that they can sustain themselves and sustain their communities and families? And you can see a little bit more of the background information on the link that's provided there. We also provide witness to the global story, to the impact that climate change and environmental destruction has on the world's most vulnerable. And so we offer a whole collection of stories through our media center or newswire, through stories themselves that are posted on the website, through videos as well. Our third aspect of outreach, or where CRS can help, is in the resources that we offer to help you engage your community, either school or parish. There's a number of resources offered on the encyclical itself, but also on the much broader concept of care for creation and on the issue of climate change. And CRS Education offers numerous resources for family and for children, for youth at the high school level, and for adult education as well. You'll see later this year, if you're working in a school community, that NCEA will be featuring resources from Catholic Charities USA and from Catholic Relief Services to try to help bridge the local and the global dimensions of climate change and caring for creation. And then finally, a number of our programs will be highlighting some aspect of the encyclical or some aspect of understanding the impact of climate change on the world's poor and vulnerable. And finally, too, along with the bishops, we invite people into taking their faith into the public square through advocacy. How do we lift up our concern, our hope for change, and our willingness to engage this issue to our leaders in this country? Catholics Confront Global Poverty is the USCCB and CRS advocacy initiative that looks at the global realities. And more recently, a way of engaging that with a particular audience has been through the CRS University program, where we have the I Am Climate Change campaign. You can learn more about that because you may find that some of those resources are easily adaptable for your own communities. And then finally, there are a number of other resources, and I'm sure over the months to come, you're going to see many, many resources from publishers like Ave Maria Press and a number of other Catholic organizations as well. Catholic Rural Life helps to tell the domestic story of the impact of environmental destruction or environmental concerns and climate change. NFCYM offers a number of resources for those of you working with middle and high school youth and young adults. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't lift up the women's religious orders who have been speaking about environmental concerns and environmental justice for so long. And if you look at a number of their resources and websites, particularly the Mercy Sisters, the School Sisters of Notre Dame, the S&Ds, and so many others, there is a wealth of resources all around environmental justice that helps to frame the much broader virtue of care for creation, and I've even seen other resources coming up around the encyclical. So hopefully this is a little bit of a library that gets you started and gives you a place to go to begin to unpack the encyclical with your own community. So we have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to pause there and see what questions might come up. And if there's other ideas too, or other resources that you'd like to mention or share with each other, I encourage you to do so.
Great. Ted, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and that library of resources you offered. That's really an excellent collection here. I'm going to take control back over so to remind people where they can ask questions if they would like. So as usual, if you'd like to ask a few questions, go ahead and find that questions section of the GoToWebinar panel. We can offer them here to Ted before he finishes up. So I've got a few questions as we wait for some people to jump in. First of all, I just want to say thanks for having that wide collection of resources. It was great. It's great to see that there's so much going on, and there's somewhat of a kind of a coordination going on amongst the national organizations. So I'm seeing a lot of you all working together. So it's not just Catholic Relief Services doing its own thing and Catholic Climate Change doing something else. This is great.
Very true.
So I'm just kind of curious. You know, some people might have been surprised by the Pope's encyclical on climate change when he's been so focused on people here, the focus on the poor, the poverty in the country, in throughout the world. And then he wrote this encyclical on climate change, or not climate change, but on climate and ecology in general. What is the connection that he makes, or that we should see between climate and poverty throughout the world?
Well, one, I definitely think it's a theme that he continues throughout this encyclical. Pope Francis does not shy away from naming some of the more challenging systemic issues that help to contribute to the global inequality that we see within our world and how the environment fits into that. So I think what Pope Francis is doing is creating a much bigger framework to help us understand the interconnectedness of so much about our lives. So for instance, take his reflection on technological and economic development and his desire to help us to understand that technology and the economy are not necessarily bad, but technological development and economic development must be done in a way that serves people and serves all of God's creation, not as a way of exploiting it or as a way of creating an economy or a technology of exclusion where it only benefits some. And so what I think what I see him trying to do in all of this is helping us to understand the deeper levels of connectedness, that it isn't just a matter of saying all of creation's good, but it's also a matter of saying all these decisions that I make through technology, through economy, through culture, through society, through family, all impact not just me, but they also impact each other, my brothers and sisters around the world, and it impacts the earth, the health of the earth, and the life of all that is. So it's a way of trying to, I see, make a much bigger cosmological vision, if you will, of connectedness.
Thanks. So we'll shift from the theological to more to the practical, as you talked about. And before I get to some questions that are coming in, and some of these questions are great, I'm just envisioning a lot of parishes, so a situation where something like this would happen, or a pastor would come to the adult faith formation coordinator or the DRE or the youth minister and say, "Hey, I need you to schedule a night about Laudato Si, and I need you to do it, in the next couple of weeks." If you were in that situation, what would you put together? What would you suggest people do? They had to throw something together to be able to introduce either adults or youth to this encyclical, at least the themes. How would you approach that?
I definitely would start with the framing of the care for creation, and to use Laudato Si as a stepping stone into the much bigger virtue of just that. And so to have a night where there's video, there's art, there's more personal reflection and dialogue, I think you could do a whole series where you begin with just people sharing their stories of their own experience of God's creation, or lack thereof, which may be very telling as well. But that just helping people to bring forth their own stories, their own understanding, and then moving that into some of the challenges that we can all agree on, the challenges that affect all of us that we're very visible, that we see, and then gradually moving into the more thorny issues. I think if we continue to put climate change up first, as urgent as it is, um, we may turn off the very people that we need to be engaging in dialogue. So the reality is, most Catholics all now know that this is out there. But if we can begin to frame it in this long-standing tradition and in this desire to really look at all of God's creation and how do we care for it, that might be a way of meeting people where they're at and then bringing them along.
Yeah, and
So that's, I think, how I...
we have a couple of different questions about kind of the hot button issues, how to address or respond to people that are objecting to or disagreeing with or feeling threatened by capitalism and those kinds of things. Anything else to add to counsel some of our parish leaders who are going to be meeting with people who would be kind of antagonistic towards the encyclical?
Yeah, I think for one, we have to avoid any blame or judgment game, and we have to just simply go in to acknowledge the discomfort of the situation. When we really look at gospel values should be and do make us uncomfortable. All too often, however, the mistake has been made of watering down the gospel. Pope Francis does not shy away from that. So how do we enter into that dialogue? One, by just simply acknowledging how uncomfortable this makes us feel. And if I'm in a pew and I'm hearing a priest say, "I'm just uncomfortable about this," that makes it a little bit real for me and makes it a little bit safe, and then leads me to say, okay, I can talk about this. So I do think that's one step, and I guess I would reiterate that aspect of bringing people along. And so looking at some of those gathered and non-gathered ways of dropping the hints, helping people to have access to information that speaks a little bit more about it. So if they're not going to come out to an adult education night or a discussion around Laudato Si, hopefully they're picking up the bulletin and they're taking that with them. Or hopefully maybe there's folks within a community that are willing to take leadership and do the personal invitation along. And as we know, as a former youth minister, personal invitation was what always worked best, and I think it's in this particular topic area that personal invitation is really going to be important.
Thanks, Ted. I think a great answer. We have an interesting question from Lynn. She said, how can Laudato Si be part of the Year of Mercy? Any suggestions there?
Absolutely. Couple thoughts. I think Laudato Si is inviting us to a greater sense of compassion, particularly for those who have been out of our sight, ostracized, disregarded. It's interesting. Pope Francis makes the connection between the throwaway culture of materials to how we treat the poor and vulnerable. And oftentimes the poor are simply disregarded. That's an aspect of throwaway culture. So making more intentional effort of inviting people in and including people of all socioeconomic backgrounds, people who are struggling, and people who are just desiring a new connection with the church. So his whole culture of encounter, I think, is key to all of this and flows right into the Year of Mercy. And even the faith itself, we talk about the earth, if we acknowledge that humanity is part of creation, it is the lifting up of the life and dignity of all people. I also think being more compassionate with the earth, it's where we get a bit from our American sisters and brothers, their own of healing the earth, perhaps even in our own healing, masses or healing prayer services that we including within that a framing of the healing of the earth itself. And when you look, it's a nation of patience for, and so to put that into for the decisions that we've made, that we find ourselves, or we may have missed the mark throughout the year, different aspects would tie really well into the year of mercy.
Thanks, Ted. You're starting to break up a little bit here, but I think we've reached our time. We're just a little bit after 4 o'clock anyways, and we've got a number of different questions coming in, some great comments from different people pointing out their own personal reactions, that how much they've, first of all, enjoyed your presentation, but also the encyclical itself that's focused on ecumenical communities, its opportunities to talk about
Absolutely.
language with person language, with poverty and people who are different ways of translating it in valuable ways into English. So there's some really great questions. I wish we had more time to address some of those things, and people that have talked about, the care of gifts from the earth to God that God has given us. It's the way of framing it, and I think you've been a very articulate, Ted, and thank you so much for offering your insights and your resources. As you said earlier, we have all these links that you've talked about, all the different resources. We'll have these up along with the recording later on this week. So thanks for sharing that with all of us.
Great. Thank you all.
Okay, well, everybody, thanks so much for being here. I just want to offer a quick invitation to, well, first of all, thank you to our partners, once again, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. Feel free to connect with Ave Maria Press at any of the most popular social media networks. Of course, this webinar is being recorded. It will be added to all the webinar recordings at our website, avemariapress.com/webinar-videos. And I want to make a quick invitation to anyone who's here, but also anyone who's been a part of this series to join us in 2 weeks on November 10th for the next webinar in this series. We'll offer a panel of experts just 1 week before NCYC in Indianapolis. We'll be offering this webinar for anybody who's in a parish or who is a youth minister or a chaperone getting ready to go to chaperone those kids over to join 20,000 other Catholic youth. Ted, have you ever been to NCYC back in your youth ministry days?
Absolutely, and we'll be back there again. CRS is offering the Helping Hands program, so if you're bringing your group, feel free to look for us.
Awesome. We'll see you there. So next week or 2 weeks from now, 10 ways to get the most out of NCYC before, after, and during the event. Of course, Bob McCarty from NFCYM will be there. Kevin Fan, Cindy Case, Kim McMillan, and Jackie Francois Angel will be there as she's the MC of the event. So we have a large panel of people who will be talking about those 10 ways, and then also just answering questions for anybody who's interested in hearing more about how they can get ready for and unpack NCYC, which will be coming up next month. So Ted, thanks again for being with us and offering your insights and your resources. Really, really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, take care, everybody.
Take care.